Welcome to the UK news on September 30th in 2021. Today, once again, we have to start with the fuel crisis. The London government has put army truck drivers on standby in the face of the UK fuel crisis. These should be prepared to deliver to petrol stations, it said in a message on Tuesday night. In the UK, many petrol stations are currently running dry due to lack of truck drivers. For decades, British logistics companies have hired drivers from the EU who have been absent since Brexit restrictive immigration regulations. The Forwarding Association, as you know, speaks of up to 100,000 drivers. Drivers from the EU simply don't feel welcome anymore since Brexit, reports a freight forwarder. In addition, there are countless forms that have to be filled out for every transport. We have always been an island people, but now we are more than ever, he said. This has already led to gaps in supermarket shelves and drained taps in pubs. Now it's the turn of the petrol stations. Even if the British government issued 5,000 additional work visas over the weekend, more and more petrol stations have recently had to close. The problem is exacerbated by a psychological phenomenon that led to the toilet paper crisis during the first lockdown in this country. There is panic buying, what we in Germany call hamster shopping, by the way. Long lines form in front of many petrol stations. Several oil companies called on people on Monday to stop hoarding. The pressure on the petrol stations will decrease in the coming days because many cars are now full. Economy Minister Kwasi Kwarteng also emphasized that demand will return to normal levels in the coming days. Nevertheless, it's right to take precautions. If necessary, the deployment of military personnel will temporarily provide the supply chain with additional capacity in order to alleviate the pressure caused by local fluctuations in demand, said Kwarteng. And now we go to a topic I called angry. In Germany, he is celebrated as the election winner. In the United Kingdom, however, Chancellor candidate Olaf Scholz from the Social Democrats has put himself in the nettles, as we would say, with a slogan about the fuel crisis. The nerves of motorists have been on the island on the brink for days because there is a lack of truck drivers. As I said already, the gasoline and diesel supplies for the petrol stations have collapsed. Most of the petrol pumps are therefore out of order. Wherever something is still going, people are hoarding and increasingly threatened and even beaten. There are long queues. The price of fuel is at an 8-year high. The government is therefore currently considering, as I said, deploying the army and additional work visas. Forget that one. There's also discussion about giving preferences to certain professional groups such as doctors, teachers or police officers. And in the midst of this explosive mood, Olaf Scholz made the front pages of several British newspapers by simply saying the obvious, that the fuel chaos is linked to Brexit, which disgusted tens of thousands of EU workers in a lot of countries. Scholz contradicted the British government, which blames the aftermath of the corona pandemic for the truck drivers' misery, which has long been tearing holes in the food supplies, for example. We have worked hard to convince the British not to leave the Union, Scholz teased, referring to the principle of free movement of workers, which protects the EU from similar problems. Scholz also attributed the shortage of truck drivers, and once again we are still talking about 100,000, to meager wages. If you can't find enough people who want to do the job, it may have something to do with the working conditions, he said. And then, Brexit is to blame for the British fuel crisis, says the top candidate for Merkel's successor, headlined the renowned Guardian on Tuesday. Not even one foot in the Chancellery and already on a course of confrontation with the government of Boris Johnson, alias Brexit Boris. But is that really wise? The ruling Tories were initially reluctant to respond to Scholz's statement, while the Labour opposition cautiously agreed. Scholz is right. Now we are feeling the reality of Brexit, said former State Secretary for Economic Affairs Anna Soubry. Is that wise? Of course that's wise. Whoever will be Chancellor, talk the truth. But now let's talk about visa then. Despite the bottlenecks in the fuel supply, the British Prime Minister Johnson does not want any preferential treatment for systemically important occupational groups. The situation at the petrol stations is already improving, he said. The population should go about their business normally and only refuel for the time being if it is really necessary. At the same time, he defended the end of the free movement of workers in the context of Brexit. Johnson said he didn't think the British wanted to solve all uncontrolled immigration problems again. They've tried that for years. That is not the way Britain should develop. Unions had demanded priority at the pumps for professional groups such as doctors, nurses, teachers and police officers. Food manufacturers warned of problems for supermarkets and schools against returning to online lessons. Amateur soccer games have already been cancelled. One reason for the lack of fuel is, once again, the lack of an estimated 100,000 truck drivers. Many foreign workers left the country after Brexit and don't want to come back. And we have to talk about corona victims this week, because around a year after the first demands, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson met with relatives of corona victims. Even though the government is trying to get out of the pandemic and almost says the pandemic is over, we are still losing around 1,000 people every week. COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice co-founder Joe Goodman said this before a meeting to the BBC. We are the voice of those who are still at risk, of families who can still lose someone, she said. In the largest British part of England, corona restrictions have been largely lifted since mid-July. The number of cases has leveled off at a high level, currently at an incidence of around 350. In the past 7 days, 920 people died of or with COVID-19. In the previous weeks, it looked similar. The relatives of the previous victims had already called for a meeting with Johnson and an independent investigation of the corona policy last year in order to prevent further errors. However, this should not take place before next spring. With nearly 160,000 victims of COVID-19 on their death certificates, the United Kingdom is one of the countries hardest hit by the pandemic in Europe. The relatives organization COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice, which operates local groups across the country, has erected a national COVID memorial for the victims in London, not far from Parliament, on the banks of the Thames. Over hundreds of meters, small and large red hearts adorn a stone wall. And now we have to talk about a topic I called Flashed Off, talking about truck drivers again. Polish truck drivers turn their backs on the offer to help fight supply shortages in Great Britain for 3 months. No thanks, Prime Minister. I will not take this opportunity, says Jakub Pajka, behind the wheel of his red truck in a parking lot outside Warsaw. And he said, no driver wants to move for just 3 months just to make it easier for the British to prepare for the Christmas holidays. The 35-year-old quit his job in the UK because of Brexit. On Sunday, the British government of Prime Minister Johnson announced that it would issue 5,000 visas for foreign truck drivers until December 24th in view of ongoing supply shortages. Their main task is to transport petrol to filling stations. The extra money could not make up for the hassle of moving, the threat of migrants trying to cross the channel in the back of a truck, or being separated from his family, says Pajka. And he says, the money that can be made in the UK does not compensate a driver for all the dangerous things that happen to him right there. And you know the feeling now the people have. Jacek Rembikowski, a 60-year-old trucker in another parking lot, has a similar opinion. He worked in the UK for 7 years before returning to Poland because of the UK's exit from the European Union. At that time, it was unclear how the drivers would be treated and whether they would still be needed after Brexit, explains Rembikowski. In view of the panic buying at petrol stations and supply bottlenecks among the population, Johnson assured an adequate supply. We want to make sure that we make all the necessary preparations to hold out until Christmas and beyond, not only in the supply of petrol stations, but in all supply chains, said the Prime Minister in London. If necessary, the army, as I said earlier, should also help to bridge the bottlenecks in the petrol supply. Great Britain is already struggling with rising gas prices, which are driving up energy costs and have led to a shortage of goods. There were occasional scuffles because drivers were jostling for access to the gas pump. Pictures were posted on the internet showing people pouring petrol into old water bottles instead of reserve canisters. Transport Secretary Grant Shapps therefore called on citizens to refrain from "This is dangerous," he said. In some parts of the country, up to 90% of the petrol stations were without fuel, as the industry association PRA announced. Sometimes long queues formed in front of the remaining gas pumps. There is an estimated, once again, 100,000 shortage of truck drivers in the UK. Because of Brexit, many truckers have returned to the European continent. In addition, the corona restrictions meant that training came to a standstill. Economy Minister Kwasi Kwarteng said soldiers could help out with the petrol deliveries, but even if you put them on standby, of how much help will this be? And how much can the army still work then? Well, the British Medical Association demanded preferential fuel access for health workers, by the way, so that they can come to hospital and practices. And I'll see you in my next video. Bis gleich.